Hey everyone, this is Nitro. In this video, I am finally going to get around to doing a video on the way to build Jugler, who is known as the Eater of Runestones because he truly needs all his classes unlocked, which means you need to give him 4 runestones in order to use him. Now, before I begin talking about how to build Jugler, I should first mention that Jugler's exclusive helmet is released on August 8th, and it's actually one of the best exclusives in the game. It's basically a must if you plan to use him. His exclusive helmet, what it gives him is, first of all, it gives him 5% hit points, which isn't all that much. But more importantly, what it allows him to do is to restore 10% of his hit points after every battle, and in addition to that, it also allows him to equip 3 2-point skills. So, whereas other characters are limited to 2 2-point skills and then 1 1-point skill, he can use 3 separate 2-point skills. So, basically, in order to use him, you really should get that exclusive helmet. So, my version of how to build Jugler will be based on, first, that you have all his classes unlocked, and second, that you have his exclusive helmet. Okay, so with all that said, let's begin. So, I should also mention that before I talk about building him is his first class should always be Tiamat and then into Behemoth. And the reason for that is because Jugler's third bond, in order to unlock his third bond, the critical bond which affects soldiers, you need to have him in his Behemoth class, right? So, that right there, given that this third bond increases the hit points and defense of his soldiers by 15%, that's a very critical bond. So, no matter what, you have to get that class first, okay? In addition to that, though, not only does it unlock his third bond, more importantly, it gives him access to his only Lancer soldier, which is the Stone Colossus. Okay? So the combination of these factors, unlocking the third bond and giving him his only Lancer soldier, means you must get that class first. Even though this class is really his worst class, you have no choice but to do it. His usable classes are actually his Hydra and Behemoth class, and we'll talk about that shortly. So, with all that said, I should also mention one other unique aspect of Jugler, and that's actually his Hydra class, okay? Normal heroes all basically do 20 attacks in their rounds of combat, okay? So each attack does reasonably low amount of damage, but they do 20 attacks, which adds up to a lot, right? Generally speaking, in an extreme case, with the 20 attacks, you could theoretically do 10 attacks to wipe out all 10 soldiers of the enemy, then do 10 attacks to wipe out the enemy hero. Okay? That's an extreme case that occurs when your hero is extremely overpowered compared to the enemy heroes. But generally speaking, what normally occurs is your 10 soldiers kills off the enemy 10 soldiers, and then your hero kills off the enemy hero. That's the normal situation. However, Jugler's Hydra class is totally different. It only has 6 attacks. These 6 attacks have very high damage. In fact, Jugler's 6 attacks has comparable damage to a standard hero's 20. However, what that means is, if Jugler's soldiers fails to kill off the enemy soldiers, his 6 attacks will be wasted on enemy soldiers, thus leaving you with basically no damage to the enemy hero. So that's one huge demerit to Jugler's Hydra class, okay? It's not an issue if you're fighting against a boss that has no soldiers. For example, in the Eternal Temple, the bosses have no soldiers. Similarly, most of the dragons have no soldiers either. But it definitely kicks into play in both PvP and PvE very often. So you need to be aware of that. Hydra class in general is terrible for dishing out damage against enemies with soldiers. One other unique point about the Hydra class is that if this Hydra class is using Juggler's only attack skill, which is Beast Shock, it will do the regular 20 lower damage attacks. And in that situation, whenever Hydra uses Beast Shock, you'll basically one-shot the enemy. I'll go into greater detail about the power of Beast Shock later, but that's all you need to know. Generally speaking, Hydra is a pure tank class. It won't do much damage in retaliation, but it tanks damage like mad. But if you use his attack skill, he will kill off an enemy. Okay, so with all those unique points about Juggler talked about, let's go into his talent to start. So you can tell right here that this is going to be a very long video. Alright, his talent. All accessible landforms are regarded as planes when moving. This is a huge bonus because Juggler can only move through, grass, mountains, and he can't fly, right? But all the terrain, regardless of what it is, he considers it as planes. So he can move fully no matter what terrain there is on the map. Very useful, very versatile. Okay. Generally not as much use when you're playing the tank role, but incredibly useful if you're using Juggler offensively. Alright, in addition to that effect, damage taken by the hero is reduced by a certain percentage depending on the soldier's missing hit points. Okay. Finally, he will heal other friendly units after taking damage, and recovered hit points is equal to a certain percentage of Juggler's unit hit points. Okay? So, very important, right? I mean, first of all, the damage reduction value, let's talk about that. At 3 stars, it's 1%. At 4 stars, it's 1.5%. At 5 stars, it's 2%. And at 6 stars, it's 3%. Overall, that damage reduction is very minor, all things considered, right? 1 to 3% is really not that much. But the heal is huge, right? At 3 stars, it's 10%. 4 stars, it becomes 15%. 5 stars is 20%. And 6 stars is a 30% heal of Juggler's hit points. So, because of this talent, right, it makes basically AoE attacks useless, right? AoE attacks will basically damage Juggler and Juggler will heal everyone else and they'll be healed up to full and so on. So that's why Juggler is an incredible tank for PvP, because he can utterly make AoEs useless. Now, with all that said, let's go into his classes and talk about his best classes. So as always, you need to get Tiamat and Behemoth, and Behemoth is generally considered his worst class because it has lower hit points than the other 2 classes, lower defense, and the only defining feature of it is that it has higher magic defense, which is honestly quite useless, right? From the Tiamat class, he gets Battle Cry, and as we know from Vargas, Battle Cry only takes into effect when you attack. But it can dispel 1 buff and decrease the enemy's attack and defense by 10%. Lasts 1 turn. Overall, this skill is very rarely used on Juggler because A, it's a 1-point skill and he should always be using 2-point skills if possible. So, and B, it only applies when attacking, and Juggler generally doesn't attack. So it does have use occasionally. Let's say maybe if you're using him as an offensive character against the Thunder Dragon, but it's very much a situational skill, very rarely used. Great Dragon Barrier from the Behemoth class. This one is basically a tanking skill against magic attacks, right? Passive, take magic damage for adjacent friendly units. Active, the range of guard increases to 2 blocks, and it grants the Great Dragon Barrier effect, where it converts 1.4 times of the magic defense into attack and renders all friendly units within 2 blocks immune to fixed damage. Lasts 2 turns. Do note that this skill has a 4-turn cooldown, while it only lasts 2 turns. The main effect, the main reason to bring it, would be if you got put into a situation in, let's say, Summit Arena, where you're facing a Listel and you have no real way to counter her. Then you might actually consider bringing the Great Dragon Barrier for the immunity to fixed damage, to counter her Blood Dance. But that's an extremely, extremely rare case, okay? So, and this would only be a situation that would occur if you were using a Hydra Jugler. Okay, so just to be aware, it's such a rare situation that it would almost never occur. Other than that, he also gets Magic Defense Command, 2-point skill once again. Passive, magic defense of all friendly units within 2 blocks increases by 15%. Once again, very rare skill to bring on Jugler, simply because Jugler being Origin's faction, right, you would probably have a built-up Luna. And Luna would be the one providing magic protection in general. So this skill, it's quite rare in general. That's how I see it. Unless you somehow needed to bring it to increase Luna's damage, because the additional magic defense would help increase Luna's attack value. So that's the only possible use I could see for this skill, but incredibly rare to bring, is the conclusion. Next, the Scylla class. The Scylla class gives Jugler his bread and butter tanking skill, and this tanking skill is Triton. Passive, take physical damage for adjacent friendly units. When in water, convert 1.4 times defense into attack. Okay? That's an interesting point. The important thing about this skill is active. The range of guard increases to 2 blocks, and it grants the effect Tidal Surge. The terrain you are on will be regarded as water. Lasts 2 turns. In other words, as long as you activate the skill, Jugler's attack value is replaced by 1.4 times his defense value. What that means is, effectively, Jugler doesn't really need attack, because his attack is equal to 1.4 times his defense. The interesting point to note here about Jugler is it's not as good as, let's say, Vargas's Power Stab, which is 1.6 times, right? Or Vargas's Unbreakable Guardian. Nonetheless, 1.4 times is quite respectable. Okay? So that is Jugler's Triton skill and his guard skill. Also keep in mind that this Scylla and Hydra class is an aquatic unit, right? And aquatic units, when in water, get increased defense value, right? They get a defense boost. I can't recall quite what the percentage increase is, but it's fairly significant. So as soon as you activate the skill, right, he gets a defense boost, and then with the defense boost, his 1.4 times his defense is his attack. So it gives Jugler very high attack stat and very high defense stat as a result. From his Hydra class, he gets first Precaution. When attacking, defense increases by 12%. Okay. Generally speaking, you won't bring this. It's interesting to note because, you know, once again, further increase to his defense means further increase to his attack value. Other than that, his final skill in the Hydra class is an AoE attack skill. And it's quite a powerful one. Okay, it's an ultimate skill, which means the cooldown is 5 turns. It has a span of 4 blocks and it targets himself. What it does is it deals 0.25 times AoE damage to enemies within 4 blocks. More importantly though, it changes the terrain they are on to water for 2 turns. At the end of the turn, you once again gain Tidal Surge. So once again, you get the Tidal Surge, your attack value is replaced by 1.4 times your defense. Okay? And this lasts for 2 turns as well. So, the key point about this skill, to be honest, is the fact that it changes the terrain the enemy is on to water. This can absolutely mess up a lot of enemies. For example, Leon, right? Being cavalry class, if he's put on water, he can only move 1 tile. Okay? Same thing for a lot of the, you know, Elwyn, Ledin, like all the infantry class characters are basically screwed if they're placed on water. Same with assassins, you know, archers and assassins, same thing, they can barely move in water. Same with lancers. The only characters who can really move in water are flyers and aquatic units. So if you use that AoE skill, they can barely move. So it's an amazing skill. Note that the effect can be dispelled, right? It can be dispelled, freeing them to have their proper mobility. but if you combine it with other debuffs, then the enemies can be in serious trouble. Alright, so last but not least, let's talk about his Cerebus and Behemoth class, right? Cerberus? Whatever. Okay, so Cerberus doesn't give a very useful skill. It gives first aid. Self-heal skill heals you to 100% of your health, right? I've always felt that you always bring a tank with, you always bring a healer with a tank, so this skill doesn't particularly mean much. So, let's go on to Behemoth. And Behemoth gives him 2 additional useful skills. The first one is a faction buff. Tanks that can faction buff themselves are always a huge advantage, so it's a very nice one to have. And this one actually has an extra effect. When attacking, and your unit's hit point percentage is higher than the enemy's, increase damage dealt by 15%. So in addition to the usual faction buff effects, if the enemy is damaged and you're at full health, you're going to basically get a guaranteed kill. That's what it means, right? Because, yeah. So, other than this faction buff, he also has Beast Shock, right? And Beast Shock attacks a single enemy unit and deals 1.5 times damage in battle. That's already powerful. But it has more effects than just that, okay? Before entering battle, you receive Beast Shock effect. Beast Shock adds 40% of your magic defense and defense values to your attack, and renders all enemies within 1 block adjacent to you unable to move or guard. This lasts 1 turn. Crazy effect, okay? 40% of your magic defense and defense value to your attack, that's huge, right? And think about this, you can combo it even further with the 1.4 times defense into attack values. So he can have a ridiculous amount of attack with Beast Shock effect in play. And in addition to that, it lasts 1 turn, right? So your attack turn, you're going to have that ridiculous attack value. And the turn after that, when you do a second attack, you'll still have that crazy attack value. Just keep in mind, once again, that Hydra does 6 attacks, so that will likely be absorbed by all the soldiers. But if your Juggler is in his Behemoth class, it means he gets 2 attacks with extremely high attack value. So, just an amazing skill in general. And the secondary effect of rendering all enemies' units 1 block adjacent to you unable to move or guard is also crazy, right? Just, there's not much else that needs to be said about it. It's just an amazing skill. You know, the attack, you know, the guaranteed kill pretty much, as well as, you know, making tanks unable to guard or making enemies unable to move. It's just, it can completely mess up an enemy. So, yeah, you can see he has a lot of very powerful and versatile skills, right? The most powerful ones are Faction Buff, Beast Shock, the Guard skill, and Master of Ice. So there's 4 great skills and you have to choose 3 of them in general. So it's very hard to choose the skill combo. Generally speaking, right, you would probably always bring Beast Shock, right? Then you would pick 2 of either Triton, the Guard skill, Mark of the Sacred Beast, the faction buff for Organs characters, and finally Master of Ice, right? If you're using an offensive juggler and there's someone else to faction buff him, let's say Zerida or Diehard or Freya, you know, then in those situations where someone else can faction buff, by all means, you can just bring a fully offensive juggler with Beast Shock, Master of Ice, and then the 3rd skill would probably be Battle Cry, right? The most likely situation is you'll have to faction buff yourself though. So you'll probably bring faction buff, Beast Shock, and once again, Master of Ice. So those are situations where your juggler doesn't need to tank. But other than that, right? If he's tanking, then obviously you'll probably have to bring faction buff, tank skill, and Beast Shock for a guaranteed kill on the enemy. Okay, so it'll probably be harder to fit in Master of Ice, which is a nice skill to have, but quite hard to fit in for Juggler. The only time where you could do that is, once again, if you had someone else to faction buff. Then you might be Shock, Tank Skill, and Master of Ice. So, yeah. So, I can't give you a proper skill set for him because it all depends on the situation. That's pretty much it. But he has 4 great skills, and he can equip 3 of them due to his exclusive helmet. Alright, so with all that said, let's now talk about his hero boost first before I talk about his soldiers. Okay, hero boost values. He starts off with a 5% hit point increase, 5% attack increase, and 10% defense increase. Now, I had already previously mentioned that his 3rd bond increases hit points and defense, right? So there's a 15% hit point increase, 15% defense increase. And of course, the 1st bond boosts all stats by 10%. So, when you add that all up, his final soldier boost increases are, bringing it back up, 40% hit point increase. So, very tanky soldiers. 15% attack increase. So, his soldiers don't actually do that much damage as a result. In fact, his soldiers are not likely to kill off the enemy soldiers. So that's why Juggler does not do very much damage in general. The 35% defense increase is very nice, makes them quite tanky. And then there's a 10% magic defense increase, which is pretty standard, right? So that is Juggler's soldiers hero boost. So let's talk about the soldiers he has access to. From the training ground, Juggler actually gets access to 4 soldiers. Now, most heroes have 3. He gets 4. The first one is, as you see, the Undead Knight. The second one is Lizardmen. Okay. The third one is Gargoyles. And then the 4th one is the Cyclops. So 4 different soldiers that he gets access to. It's, I think, the highest out of any hero. Does he also get Hellhounds from... Actually, I might be wrong. I think he gets 5. Yeah, sorry. He gets 5 soldiers, not 4. I was wrong. The 5th one is Hellhound. Okay, but so 5 separate soldiers. Wow, I didn't even realize it was 5. So wide variety of soldiers in general is what Juggler gets access to, right? Flyers, aquatic, undead, cavalry, and even infantry. Okay, and then in addition to that, he gets his Lancer soldier from his class. He has another infantry class, another cavalry class, and another aquatic unit, right? And also, oh yes, also the skeleton knight, so another undead unit. So he just has a lot of different soldiers that he can equip, almost ridiculously so. Okay, but in general, you can narrow it down to just a few. Okay. His most common soldiers are, of course, the Stone Colossus, because Lancer soldiers are always important to fight against cavalry. The other option is actually the Lobster Behemoth, because the Lobster Behemoth get a damage taken decrease when in water. Given his guard skill of Triton, putting him always into water, as well as Master of Ice, allowing him to do the same thing, the Lobster Behemoth will always have a damage reduction effect, which is incredible. You know, so take your pick, whether it's Stone Colossus or Lobster Behemoth. It's kind of your choice. Okay. Other than these 2, though, you would generally also choose his 5 movement soldiers, because you may have your Juggler in his Behemoth class as a cavalry unit for 5 mobility. In that case, you have to pick a 5 movement soldier, and he has access to quite a few of them. Once again, Bone Dino is one of them. Hellhound is another. Then there's Vampire Bats, Gargoyles, and Undead Knights. Okay. One important thing to note about all of these soldiers is they're all offensively based, right? Bone Dino, cavalry in general is super offensive. right? But Undead Knight, right, they only restore hit points, resurrection, when attacking. And when attacking units other than demons and holy units, their attack is increased. So there's no defense boost at all on Undead Knight. Vampire Bats are pretty much the same. When they attack, they'll heal up after the battle, right? And finally, the Gargoyles. Gargoyles are actually the most defensive of the bunch, in that when soldier hit points is above 50%, attack increases. When soldier hit points is below 50%, defense increases, right? So overall though, these three are probably the more common ones than Hellhounds and Bone Dinos. And once again, take your pick, right? You'll most likely have Vampire Bats though, because if you use Alte Muller or Leon, you'll have Vampire Bats upgraded. So that's probably the most likely 5 movement choice in terms of the soldiers. Although you may consider Gargoyles sometimes. Okay, so with the soldiers covered, so generally speaking, if you're tanking, use Lobster Behemoth or Stone Colossus. Otherwise, pick one of these 5 mobility soldiers, right? And it's important to note, a Behemoth Jugler may sometimes play a tanking role. And in that case, you'll still probably want Lobster Behemoth or Stone Colossus, rather than the 5 mobility soldiers, right? It's just that putting Juggler in a Behemoth class gives him a bit more versatility, in that he can either be a very offensive Beast Shock using character with 5 mobility, or as a tank sometimes, right? Granted though, you'll have to keep in mind, Behemoth is far less tanky, because he is no longer considered aquatic class, meaning he will no longer get the conversion of 1.4 defense. He will no longer get the defense buff from Tidal Surge effect. So just keep that in mind, right? Okay, so with all of that said, let's now talk about the enchants that you want to run on Juggler. Okay. In general, let me just stop that. Okay. In general, Juggler, because he heals based on his hit points, you're going to want to buff Juggler's hit points as much as possible. As a result, what is generally considered Juggler's best enchant is 2 separate green enchants. Okay. So you get 2, for example, Thorn enchants, which would give him 10% hit points. And then you might do 2 steel enchants, right? Because that will give another 10% hit points for a total of plus 20% hit points. So that's generally considered his best enchants. You know, of course, you can always, you know, he's a bit flexible in that sense. You might want to increase his defense and magic defense, so Beast Shock gives more attack value. And in that case, you might do, let's say, 2 greens and 2 blues. Or even 2 separate sets of 2 blues. But generally speaking, what's considered best for him is 2 green enchants. You can even give him what I did, for example, the Thorns enchant, right? And then you're hoping for some damage reflection on the enemy. But in all honesty, that's generally not considered a best enchant for Juggler at all. Because remember, Juggler as a Hydra, he doesn't attack very much. So even with the Thorns, you're not likely to kill off an enemy. So yeah. In general, Juggler is a pure tank with 2 green enchants for plus 20% hit points. That pretty much sums it up. Now, with all that said, let's talk about Juggler's gear. And I'm going to say right now, we're going to assume this Loki's mask is replaced by his exclusive helmet. So we'll go from there. Now, remember, Juggler's exclusive helmet will allow him to regenerate 10% of his hit points. And he also heals everyone else 30% of his hit points, right? So because he heals 10% of his hit points, once again, you want to max out his hit point stat, right? So let's now go into his gear, and we'll go talk about his gear based on the Google sheet, right? The Google Doc by Black Cat. Oh, before I do that though, I should mention, Juggler, because one class is aquatic and one class is actually cavalry, these 2 classes use completely different sets of gear. Jugler in Behemoth uses a cavalry set of gear, and a Jugler in Hydra class uses the aquatic set. There is no overlap whatsoever between these two classes. So you have to keep that in mind. So he has two different sets of gear that he would use. Alright, with that said, let's now jump onto the Google Sheet. So give me a moment to just bring that up. Okay, there we go. I had to update it. So now we jump onto the Google Sheet. So here we are. And let's start with his best set of gear as the aquatic class, because that's the more tanky class and that's the more common class for Jugler in PvE content anyways. So his best weapon is actually quite straightforward, right? You can, as aquatic, he can use axes or helmets, or hammers, right? Hammers give more hit points than the axes do. So that right there kind of defines what is his best in slot, right? His best in slot is generally considered to be Oath of Justice because of the defense and magic defense boosts as well as high hit points, even though it's low attack. However, he could also use the Throne Guardian quite well too. Because the Throne Guardian, while it gives less hit points, it does still give plus 5% hit points. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Throne Guardian is quite viable. Yes, you get 200 less hit points roughly, but the plus 5% does make up for it. What you do miss out on is the 8% defense and magic defense boost. So once again, that's why Oath of Justice is considered his best one. Alright, after weapons, let's talk about armor. Armor in his aquatic class is quite straightforward. The best one is Gargoyle Jacket. And it's the best because when attacked, defense increases by 15%, which also increases his attack value. More importantly though, is the fact that you're expecting to take multiple hits as a tank, right? So something like Last Rites, which only kicks in when your unit hit points is at 100%, is not considered the best in slot. So you're better off with something like Gargoyle Jacket. You could also use Demon Lizard Skin, because Demon Lizard Skin does give plus 10% hit points rather than plus 5%. And it does apply one random debuff on the enemy before combat. So that is an option. But generally speaking, it's considered the plus defense is better than Demon Lizard Skin. But either one is quite viable. Okay. So there is his best armor. Helmets we're going to skip because he uses his exclusive helmet. So let's jump into the accessories. And Jugler's best accessory is generally considered to be Blood Pact, because this one boosts his hit points but the most and gives plus 15% hit points. More importantly though, is the immunity effects that it provides. You become immune to effects that prevent you from being healed or buffed. So that immunity effect is just amazing for Jugler, right? Because his biggest worry is someone, applying cannot be healed on him. Blood Pact prevents that completely. Other than Blood Pact, for example, if you don't have one, like in my situation, what a really good one for him that's frequently overlooked is Spirit Boots. Because Spirit Boots, what they allow him to do is you can move 2 blocks after attacking a target. Okay? It increases hit points, increases defense, and gives defense increase. So that's why it's a great one for Hydra. And the move 2 blocks effect is critically important because of Beast Shock. Right? Keep in mind, Beast Shock allows you to make enemies adjacent to you unable to guard and unable to move. So being able to attack and then move 2 tiles combos insanely well with Beast Shock. So it's a very viable one. Okay. Another viable item for Jugler, believe it or not, would be the Bracer Emblem, because of the immunity to fixed damage and immunity to silence. Keep in mind though that Bracer Emblem does not give hit point increase, so there is that big drawback, right? Compared to an additional 1102 hit points and 15% hit points, you only get a 5% hit point boost here. You know, the advantage of Bracer Emblem though is first, it boosts both defense and magic defense, which combos very well with Beast Shock. And second, the immunity to silence means you can always use Beast Shock, right? So Bracer Emblem on Jugler is actually amazing for a Jugler. For a Behemoth version of Jugler, right? Where your high mobility and ability to use Beast Shock and immunity to silence will definitely kick in. So you're going to give up some hit points and some healing effect on your allies for the ability to guarantee assault with Beast Shock. Especially when you can move 5 movement, right? So I guess that really highlights the best items for Jugler in general, doesn't it? Blood Pact, Bracer Emblem, and Spirit Boots. Which one you pick is kind of up to you. And what you have available, of course. Ones like, I should also mention, things like Overlord's Badge, you know, increasing attack is not as good for Jugler. Because once again, Beast Shock, right? And also, you know, Triton. Triton replacing the attack value with defense means you generally want an accessory that gives hit points and defense values. Or pure hit points, as the case may be. So, that covers his gear in his Hydra class. So now let's talk about his gear in his Cavalry class, right? And accessories I've already covered fully, right? He can share the accessories in every single class, right? Oh, one last one I should mention. Divine Boots. Divine Boots is actually a decent choice for the Hydra. The Hydra Jugler, because it gives defense, plus 8% defense, and 509 hit points. Most importantly, it does give +1 mobility, raising your Hydra mobility to 4. The drawback is Cavalry and Flyer units cannot equip these boots, which means a Behemoth version of Jugler cannot equip this Divine Boots. So yeah, that's all the accessories that would be ideal for him. So now let's talk about the Cavalry Jugler. And the Cavalry Jugler is overall quite simple. In terms of weapons, you can use swords or lances, right? And here you really have to pick between, well, what's generally considered his absolute best one is the Yggdrasil branch, right? Good amount of hit points, lower attack, but plus 10% defense, and allows him to ignore 15% of the enemy's defense. So, you know, this is just the best weapon for him in general, right? Other than that, what can he use? Well, he could, first of all, if you're focused on more offensive versions, he could use a Cursed Lance, because this combos very well with Beast Shock, right? And you also get a chance to silence, as well as prevent them from being healed. So that's why Cursed Lance is viable. Generally not considered the best because it's purely offensive based, and Jugler may be a tank, right? But it is an option to keep in mind. Other than Yggdrasil Branch and Cursed Lance, his other very surprisingly viable weapon is, believe it or not, Dragon Slayer Graham, because of the plus 8% hit points. Okay? That pretty much sums it up, doesn't it? It gives 8% more hit points, which I think no other weapon increases hit points, really. So, there we go. Armors. In his Cavalry class, he has access to, of course, a wide variety of armors. In general, though, his best armors is probably Bloodline Magic Armor, right? Because when under melee attack, you have a 30% chance to lower the damage taken by this unit by 30%. That can definitely save you. So that's why Bloodline Magic Armor is probably considered his best armor. Other ones he can use. He could use Mirror Armor, because why not, right? Deal a bit of fixed damage to the enemy, it'll reduce the damage you take, and also counter Last Rites. Other than that, Other than that, I think those two are really the best ones in general. He could also use he could also use Aeneas' armor, because it gives the plus 10% defense and received heal increases by 10%. So he'll heal a bit more from the exclusive helmet that he has, right? Also usable. And finally, also usable, once again, is Gaia's armor, because when attacked, defense increases by 15%. And when unit hit points is above 80%, magic damage taken is decreased by 10%. So all very usable. In general though, I don't think Gaia's armor is the best one, because he does attack, and Beast Shock requires defense, right? So this one only kicking in when you're attacked is not as good for Jugler. So take your pick in general of Bloodline Magic Armor, Aeneas' armor, or Mirror Armor, right? Your choice of which one. So that covers all of Jugler's gear at this point. And as a closing note, I suppose, it's just Jugler is one of those very versatile characters, right? He's a great tank, but he can also be very offensive due to Beast Shock, right? In terms of whether you use Hydra or Behemoth, that one is up to you. Hydra is definitely tankier by far, but Behemoth gives you that added versatility of 5 mobility to allow you to more easily use the Beast Shock to attack when needed. Generally speaking though, if you're going to use the Behemoth version of Jugler, you're going to need very good enchants, right? Because in order to make up for that survivability aspect, especially with regards to, let's say, Triton, right? Replacing the defense, converting the defense into attack and so on, you're going to need really powerful enchants to survive. Like, you're talking, 15% defense increase, 15% hit point increase for both the armor and the helm, right? And then you'll probably want 10% hit points on the weapon. I think it's 10%, yeah. 10% hit points on the weapon, 10% hit points on the accessory. It's not easy to get. I would say for final form Jugler, you'll probably want Behemoth, but you're going to have to roll a lot of enchants before you can do this so. As a temporary transitional measure, I would say Hydra is better if you don't have perfect enchants. So yeah, that's everything I wanted to say. So I hope you found this video useful. I know this video was very long just because of all the options that Jugler has, right? He's both a damage dealer and a tank, and he just has access to a wide variety of soldiers, and he even has to have 2 different sets of gear, completely separate, because of his 2 classes. But nonetheless, this concludes my Jugler video, and on that note, Nitro out.